Diablo 4's open beta just ended, and with this beta, we got access to my class, the Necromancer. And so, of course, in this video, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Necromancer and how I felt about it. And while it is really strong, is it fun? Let's find out. A quick background about me is I've put thousands of hours in Diablo 3. We have a plethora of build guides in Diablo 3 for the Necromancer. Necromancer is my main class. It's what I enjoy making builds for. I played a lot of Necromancer in Diablo 2, specifically Poison Dagger, Poison Nova. And I do plan on starting a Necromancer in Diablo 4 when this game finally releases. So from a historical perspective, I feel like, I have quite a bit of a necro background. And so a lot of my viewpoints and standpoints I'm going to take in this video are going to come from that background, but also from a community of necromancers that we've sort of gained over the past, 5-10 years of playing Diablo 3. I also have obviously played a ton of Necromancer over this weekend, fully geared out a character, really locked down a spec and min-max for that spec. But I really tried absolutely everything the Necromancer had to offer. I tried every skill. I tried different kind of builds. I want to be clear before I get into this section of the video that this isn't some kind of like gotcha blizz. You're copying skills from your own game, but more to point out the lack of innovation that seems to be happening with Diablo 4. And furthermore, as a longtime Diablo player and a Diablo fan, how really dull and boring it can be to just replay skills that we've been playing for years, decades. So first up, we have the skill Decompose inside of Diablo 4. Tear the flesh from the enemy, dealing blank damage per second and forming a usable corpse every blank second. So it kind of forms this channeled ability. You hold it down and you just drain them to death. Well, in Diablo 3, we have a skill called Siphon Blood that you hold down. It channels a beam from you. You just channel and, suck the life out of your dudes until they're dead. Next up, we have Reap in Diablo 4. Sweep an ethereal scythe in front of you, hitting damage. And of course, it shoots out a scythe in front of you. It's like a frontal cone. Pretty cool looking. Well, as you would have guessed, we had the exact same skill in Diablo 3. Next up in the core skills, we have Blood Surge. You draw blood from enemies, dealing blank damage, explode Blood Nova, dealing blank damage. And of course, it's this pretty cool AoE Blood Nova around you that has these tendrils that pop out. That's pretty neat. Well, in Diablo 3, we have a skill called Blood Nova, and that looks pretty similar. Like, almost exactly the same. This one in particular is pretty interesting. We have a skill called Blood Lance and a skill called Bone Spear. Now, even on paper in Diablo 4, these skills basically do the same thing. One shoots red, one shoots green, turquoise. But what's interesting about this is it's two different skills in Diablo 4 that basically accomplish the same thing. Well, shock of shocks, in Diablo 3, there's a skill called Bone Spear, which, looks a lot like Bone Spear. But more importantly, there's a rune on Bone Spear that turns it into a Blood Spear. And that looks pretty similar to this. And then, of course, there is Corpse Explosion. You can't really get away from this one. It would be weird to have a Diablo game that didn't have Corpse Explosion, which works exactly the way you'd think. You just blow up corpses on the ground. Now, of course, it works exactly the same, and it should in Diablo 3. You just point at the corpses, and they blow up. Now, of course, I get that curses are a part of the Necro arsenal, and we'll talk about curses in a minute. But in Diablo 4, we have Iron Maiden, which makes a return from Diablo 2. It's basically thorns, and we'll talk about thorns in a minute. And then you have Decrepify, which, decreases their damage. This curse that goes out on the ground. All that exact same curse exists. Diablo 3 almost looks exactly the same. Also in Diablo 4, we have a skill called Bone Spirit, which basically uses all your essence and chooses this like really slow moving Bone Spirit that eventually connects. Shock of Shocks. In Diablo 3, we have the exact same skill. Fires this slow moving skeleton, and the animation looks exactly the same. It's like the same half corpse and everything. Next up, we have the Army of the Dead Ultimate, which basically calls forth these temporary minions to fight for you, to come to your aid. And you summon them out, and they come in and explode, and looks pretty cool. we have the same ability. It's a bit cooler in Diablo 4, but you know, it's Army of the Dead. It's like a one-time summon of huge cooldown, but works exactly like it does basically in Diablo 4. And then finally, the ultimate skill, Bone Storm. Summons a swirling bone storm around you that does damage to enemies in that area. Looks pretty cool. Obviously, anything caught in this is going to get damaged. Now, this skill doesn't exist in Diablo 3, but the Inarius set bonus does the exact same thing. Now, minions in Diablo 4 are quite different than Diablo 3, obviously, because they're good. But the animation itself is also pretty similar. So, this is skeletal warriors inside of Diablo 4. I go to summon one. You know, it's this kind of turquoisey looking dude. So it's got a sword on, like a little helmet. You know, sort of the same thing in Diablo 3. Like a sword guy. He's got a helmet on. And the same colors. I don't know, dude. Now, again, I want to drive home. This isn't like some kind of gotcha blizz. It's just like, let's innovate. You know, let's do some cool things with the Necromancer we've never seen before. But one reason I bring this up is there's obviously some kind of tech that allows Blizzard to sort of absorb stuff from Diablo 3 to maybe even like reuse code, animations, or just layer better looking animations on top of old animations from Diablo 3. So then my question becomes, why didn't we bring back good skills from Diablo 3? If we're just going to reuse stuff, let's reuse the good stuff. You know, for example, Bone Spirit was never a good skill in Diablo 3. In fact, if you probably to look at the Diablo 3 logs of skills that were ever used, Bone Spirit would be dead last. There was only a period, I think, of like 2 weeks on a seasonal PTR where Bone Spirit was playable. But outside of that, the skill's pretty garbage. And I think the same thing holds true for Diablo 4. I think it's maybe too much to ask of a skill to consume all of your essence pool. By default, that's not even like with some sort of rune attached to it through the skill tree, but by default it takes all of your essence and it doesn't really do that much damage. Not to mention the skill itself, it goes so slow. This is a big problem with it in Diablo 3. It just moves so slow, you're probably gonna miss. The honing ability isn't that great. Overall, it was like never good skill design to begin with. If we can bring back skills, you know, why don't we bring back bone armor from Diablo 3? Always a great skill. It gives you more mitigation. Great defensive skill for Diablo 4. Now, this might trigger some people, but I think the best skill that was ever created in Diablo 3 for the Necromancer is Corpse Lance. Why I really, really like Corpse Lance is because of the shortcomings of Corpse Explosion. So as we all know, you know, Corpse Explosion will damage things as long as it's close to the corpse that you consume. The reason why Corpse Lance is great is because I don't need the corpse to be near them to do damage. It just pulls the corpse from off screen and just tears it into one. It's a single target ability, so that's the trade-off, right? But I don't need it to be close. So it's nice for the scenarios where you have like a big screen full of corpses, but all the mobs are over here and you can't move them. I love Corpse Lance for exactly that scenario. But to me, this brings up another point of how Diablo 4 didn't really aim to solve the problem of corpse generation. There's one passive on the skill tree currently that your damage has a chance to create a corpse, and that chance is doubled against bosses, so that you have a greater chance against bosses to just spawn random corpses. And while that's nice, I guess, I think there's a lot more creative ideas that they could have done with this. One of the things that I always go back to, and I think this would be a fantastic idea and it would really fit the mold of Diablo 4, is to have a corpse golem. Now, what that looks like is you would basically use the skill as like an active skill to summon a corpse golem from the corpses that exist on the screen. Now, the cool thing about this is I think in Diablo 4 is they could sort of make this corpse golem like generate as he's eating the corpses that you've targeted him to eat, right? And so he gets bigger and bigger and bigger and, you know, looks more formed as he consumes more corpses, as you tell him to consume more corpses. Now, the great thing about this is that you bring that corpse golem with you, and when you want to use those corpses that you didn't get to use before, now you can use them. And what that does is, say he has a count of like 30 corpses or something like that, then you decide, I want to start using those corpses, and it sort of shreds the corpses away from the golem, like in a very disgusting Diablo 4 style way. And that way you can kind of bring corpses with you. You know, something that we've never really been able to do in a Diablo game. So instead of having like, you know, this proc where you can generate a corpse on a chance on hit, and it doesn't really make sense because it's not like, you know, you're hitting an enemy and somehow a corpse flies out of them. But instead you had this on-demand golem that you've been sort of saving up for those single target fights where there's no corpses around or trash to kill. Now, of course, looking at the skills we currently have access to in Diablo 4, I kind of wanted to go over each of the ones that I played. I did play them all, of course, and go over what I liked and what I didn't like about each one of them. Now, first up, we have Decompose, which again, I'm not a huge fan of because it is Siphon Blood from Diablo 3. And really, this skill was never used until more recently when the Trag'Oul's got a sort of a rework. But if you were to look at the skill use before that, basically no one ever used it because it's just not a fun skill. I don't like the idea of having to hold down a particular skill. I don't think the channel abilities are very fun. So I'd rather see this become like a one-time use type situation because I do think it's a good effect to the skill, like shredding a corpse once every 2.5 seconds, killing an enemy with it gives essence. But again, I think holding it down, it's just so reminiscent of Siphon Blood and it's just not very fun. Reap gives the Grim Scythe feels, but it's not bad. I mean, I do like it, especially as like a melee necro. I do like the rune that shreds a corpse just when you hit an enemy. I think that's decent corpse generation. You kind of use that to your advantage because if you can get a big pack going, you just swipe them once and you're going to have at least one guaranteed corpse to work with. I think increasing its attack speed in the current state of the game is worthless because all these basic skills just do no damage whatsoever. I think the insta-kill, you know, it's something that we had in Diablo 3. I'm not a crazy fan of it. I suppose it's a decent rune. Hemorrhage is also, I mean, again, all these basic skills just feel so blah. But Hemorrhage was pretty strong early on. It was probably the most damaging of the initial abilities for single target. But a system I really, really don't like here is the blood orbs. Right now, all they really do is heal you for 15% health. And sometimes when you pick up a blood orb, you get like these additional effects. Like this one, you know, Hemorrhage deals damage to enemies around the target. I don't like this idea. I don't like the idea of like using abilities and then picking up blood orbs to trigger other effects. I think the idea of like being in combat, especially like high level combat where you're trying not to get one shot and stuff like that, and then having this mechanic of going around and picking up orbs mid combat just so you can do something else. I'm not really crazy about that idea. Bone Splinters, as far as usability of the basic skills, I felt that it was the most useful. It was the easiest to use. I think it works pretty well in conjunction with the other bone skills. I don't like it having a chance to make enemies vulnerable. I think, you know, like the rogue had, the 3 daggers that you'd shoot out and whoever got hit with 3 daggers got vulnerable. I think that this should have something similar to that to make it more consistent. And then this other rune, we're hitting the enemy at least 3 times with bone splinters, increases the crit chance. While it's okay on single target, it obviously in a big AoE type scenario, it would never trigger. So obviously not crazy about that. Blood Surge, it's hard not to like Death Nova from Diablo 3. I do think this is a good skill to bring over. Again, if we have to copy skills and we can't think of anything new, I do like this skill in general. It looks good. AoE feels good. In the beta, it was kind of hard to determine if the healing effects would be really good because, like, you know, mitigation wasn't really a problem and the minions weren't tough enough to really survive more than a couple hits. So I didn't really get to play around with Fortify that much because it didn't seem like there were great ways of like being fortified. But the overpower, anything that's really I've seen so far that uses overpower seems to be pretty strong. So the overpower mechanic of the blood ability seems to be pretty good. But again, we didn't get a really deep dive into that because there's just not a lot of like gearing and points available to use. Blight was something I was actually really excited for because again, this is one of the brand new skills in Diablo 4. We have not seen this in other Diablo games. But it shoots out a ball, and when it collides with something, it forms this like darkness pool on the ground, which I guess I can't really show there. You can kind of see it. And this skill I felt leveling up was underrated compared to like Blood Surge and Sever. But once I really started to build shadow damage and shadow damage over time and like spec'd out the things that can sort of help shadow damage, this skill started to be pretty good. But like, you know, that runs into the Diablo 3 pit hole of skills on their own aren't good. Like you have to get a legendary aspect or you have to like build your character in such a way so that they become good. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea. So I don't know. I don't know if that's like an overhaul of the whole skill tree where skills on their own should perform, and then like you spec into them, it changes how they function. But I feel like everything should perform with like 1 point in it. You should be able to use it and it's not terrible. But yeah, later on, once I got, you know, a legendary that sucks guys in when they get hit with blight, and like I said, I built up shadow damage over time, and I built up shadow damage, and I spec'd my whole tree for shadow damage. The skill got pretty good. Sever, I actually really liked. Sever's really, really strong as well. I think it's probably one of the better ones for leveling. It's between that or Bone Spear. But Sever scales based on the amount of minions you have out, and minions are just really, really good right now. They do great damage. It also looks pretty cool, and it feels pretty good to use. Like, it's responsive. So I did like that. I'd like to see, there's only one aspect that had anything to do with Sever, and it really wasn't a good effect. So I really get to play around with that. But I think if you get some aspects around Sever, it can be a really cool skill. I did like it overall. I do think the rune, every fourth cast makes it vulnerable. I think that's pretty stupid. And lastly, of the core skills, you know, we touched on this in the Diablo 3 comparison, but having Bloodlance and Bone Spear even be two separate skills, I think is kind of insulting, because it's the same fucking skill. This is, you know, Bloodlance is just Blood Spear, really. So I don't think it should look like this at all on the skill tree. And then maybe this is unfair to other classes, because other classes aren't like this or don't have skills that are exactly the same. But say these are your core skills, and you know, right now you've got Bloodlance, and it sort of branches off, or doesn't really branch off, it just keeps going, and it looks like that. And then you've got Bone Spear that does kind of the same thing. That it shouldn't look like this at all to me. It should just look like, okay, these are your core skills, right? And then you have one that's Bone Spear, and then you've got two that branch off this way and two that branch off this way. That's it. And that's exactly the same skills. So basically, if you picked either of these, you would be Blood. And if you picked these, you'd be Bone. Like, I think it's silly. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I hate this. I absolutely hate this. I think, one, Bloodlance didn't even feel that good to play. A Bone Spear, on the other hand, it did feel pretty good once you got it juiced. But these should not be separate skills. I think, again, it's pretty insulting to even insinuate that they are different skills. This part of the tree in particular right here makes Necro feel so rushed that it's scary. You know, moving on to our, you know, Corpse and Macabre skills. Obviously, Corpse Explosion's super strong. I genuinely loved the rune that made it the damage over time on the ground. I think it looks really cool. I think it plays different. It's a brand new skill for Diablo 4. Now, on its own, leveling up, it sucks. Like, you would never pick this again. This was something that I felt that after I built shadow damage over time on my gear, and really spec'd out the tree for damage over time and shadow, then it started to kind of perform okay, but you would never just pick it on its own on the tree while leveling. Bone Prison definitely had its purpose. It looks good, and definitely like on ranged builds, this is super handy to like sort of lock enemies in. Cooldown feels a bit long, but you know, maybe with cooldown reduction late game, it won't be so bad. I didn't mind the runes, you know, generating essence seems pretty good. Again, we didn't really get play around too much with Fortify, but on paper that looks like it might be okay. Or enemies inside the Bone Prison are vulnerable. That's pretty strong, especially for Necro, because we don't have a ton of ways to inflict vulnerable. But again, this is really only useful if you played range. You cannot breach your own wall if you're playing any kind of like Necro that's, you know, melee, or you want to be up in their grill. Bone Prison was just not a good skill. So I'm sure that's intended, or maybe there's like a rune or aspect out there that lets you breach your own wall. But as of right now, it's strictly just for ranged builds. Now, everyone's using Blood Mist on beta, but that is only because there is a legendary in the game that makes your Blood Mist trigger Corpse Explosion. The skill on its own is awful. Like, you move slow, you're invulnerable, it doesn't really do any damage, and that is alarmingly our only movement skill as a Necromancer. One, I think that mobility skills are really fun in ARPGs, so that's alarming that we don't have anymore. But two, I'm a little concerned that like maybe in a group setting we won't be able to keep up with other characters that do have mobility skills. But yeah, you know, if it's, again, there's some sort of technology that lets us just, you know, absorb skills from Diablo 3 fairly easily in the development cycle, let's bring back the good old blood rush, you know? It's a great mobility skill. Curses returning to Diablo 4. I mean, I hate it. I've never enjoyed casting curses. I think that debuffs are really boring. I like debuffing an enemy as a result of like doing damage to them or a result of some sort of ability. But when I just cast a curse and that's all that happens, it's so unexciting to me. And furthermore, the animation, like you can't really tell that you've cursed mobs because they get this like weird ground effect underneath their feet instead of like what we're used to maybe in Diablo where they get this like mark over their head that shows they've been cursed. So I think I don't like that. But more importantly, I don't like curses. I don't like skills that don't do anything. And we seemingly have so many. But this is only further compounded and might be controversial to people that are a fan of Diablo 2. But Iron Maiden is back, which is thorns. So basically you curse enemies and they take more thorns damage. Thorns as a mechanic to me in a current modern ARPG sucks. To passively do damage just for getting hit, I think is just like a silly mechanic. I'm all for temporary like bubbles. So say you cast some skill, it's like bone spikes and it puts like a bone armor on you. And then maybe for like 10 seconds, enemies take X amount of bone damage if they hit you. To me, that's a skill. It's like it's more active, it's more impactful. But just passively doing damage to enemies because you have built thorns damage into your gear, I think it sucks, man. I think it's this really stupid, outdated, boring mechanic. And it seems to be just in the game to invoke nostalgia. I'm sure it's going to be good, but man, building a thorns character is just so lame. So lame to me. And I'm sure there's people out there that love it, but I just don't get it. Never will. Corpse Tendrils is another one of those brand new skills. You know, on paper, when I saw this, was very excited for it. I think it sounds good, like pulling enemies together, pixeling enemies, as sometimes it's called, is really strong in ARPGs sometimes. And so I do like on paper how this skill could perform. I also like the runes. You know, it stuns enemies by default as part of its base rune, and then you can get it to make enemies vulnerable, which again is only like a couple ways to inflict vulnerable as a Necromancer. But in practice, the skill sort of feels a little lackluster. One, because it's not immediate. I think that is the biggest problem with it. I think when you cast this skill, it should automatically suck dudes in. And I know like the developers probably worked really hard on this animation, so they want the whole animation to go off when you cast the skill. But you need this thing to go off immediately. Waiting 2 seconds for it to go off, I just don't think is good for the skill. I think by the time it finally triggers, you probably past the point that you needed it to. I don't know. I think it just needs to be instant probably. And again, I think this ability will get better as Diablo gets harder because enemies just die too fast for this to be useful at all. But I do like this skill in concept. Ultimates we sort of touched on in our review video. I think that everyone should just get an ultimate. I don't think it should take up a skill slot. I don't really like that idea. I don't like forcing every class into basically needing cooldown reduction because all these cooldowns are like crazy high. I think even having cooldowns longer than 30 seconds in Diablo 4 is just like a miss. But honestly, none of them felt that great. I do have a legendary that turns the Blood Wave and Bone Storm into shadow damage, which kind of made them somewhat interesting, I suppose. But again, you know, Bone Storm is Bone Storm from Diablo 3. That wasn't very interesting. Army of the Dead does perform quite differently, but overall it sucked. It wasn't strong. Does no damage for it being on an 80-second cooldown, and this is with me, cooldown reduction. And then seemingly nothing that the skill is going to provide will make it any better. The same thing with Blood Wave. It's like a one-time skill use. It's 50-second, I think, by default. And knocking enemies back, I mean, I guess if you're ranged, it's okay, but it's also a blood skill, so would you really want to be knocking enemies back? I guess if you're using Blood Lance or what I like to call Blood Spear, it would be okay, but 50 seconds is just so much, and that damage is not enough to make up for that time. So unless we see some aspects that really change how these ultimates work, they're kind of not that good. But again, we're going back to what I said before, is these skills don't perform on their own. They're not good on their own. Then we're doing the exact same thing we did in Diablo 3. I shouldn't need a fully geared character with aspects on every slot to feel the power of a skill. It should be good on its own. Now, some of the other stuff on this tree sounds like it could be kind of fun. Like, the Shadow Blight, the Vigor. I mean, all of these sound really fun at the bottom here. I think these specializations sound interesting on paper, but we just didn't have enough points and really like aspects and gear available to test each one like to the fullest of their potential, or even to get onto like the first base of their potential. So it's really hard to say if these feel impactful or they're that good. But honestly, a lot of these things on the skill tree on paper are just not that exciting. I think we said in the Diablo 4 review video that we need access to way more skills. Like there should just be way more skills in the game. And I think again, if we have this weird D3 import technology, like we can do that. Hopefully, I don't know how it works, but there's obviously something going on there. Each one of these skills should have like 6 branches minimum. We just don't have enough options. We just don't. There's not enough here. One of the things I did like in Diablo 4 beta for the Necromancer is the summon skills. The summons were undoubtedly strong. And it was almost surreal. As someone who's played so much Diablo 3, like minions are so bad in Diablo 3. The only one that's worth anything is the skeletal mages, and they're temporary, right? The minions that stay with you forever are just not good. So to have these minions like be good, they do good damage. Like you could make builds where you're kind of not doing anything and you're just watching them like do their damage. It's just crazy because I haven't really experienced this since like Diablo 2, where minions actually do damage in Diablo. So yeah, overall, minions are great and they do damage. However, flip side of that coin is I think as it stands right now, it's just never in your best interest, at least the way that the game stands right now, is to not run them. So basically, as a Necromancer, you are locked into being a minion guy. 1, because the minions are good. They're really good. 2, because the effects you get for sacrificing them are awful, like laughably not good compared to just having those minions out. I think the Book of the Dead mechanic is interesting. I'd love to see there be way more options for pets. Side note as well, all the pets look exactly the same. They're the same color. Maybe they have different weapons. To me, it doesn't seem like frost mages should look like shadow mages. They should be like at least like a different color. They do have different weapons, so they're different in that regard, but they all look exactly the same. That's just a side note. But again, I think the Book of the Dead is an interesting concept. I think that we should see way more runes inside the Book of the Dead per each minion. I think that the sacrifice should be way more impactful. And again, this is 25 and people are like, well, maybe it doesn't scale. These are just the flat things that you get. Like sacrificing the sheer damage of the skeletal warriors for 5% crit would never ever be worth it. Ever. Same thing with the mages. None of these effects would make up for not having the mage. Same with the golem. None of these effects would make up for not having a golem. So you're just always going to be running minions if the game stays as it is. For me, it's hard to sort of come up with a balanced way to think of, like, obviously you could buff these sacrifice effects, but even still, is it going to be worth it? Because not only do minions do good damage, but at the same time, you have to factor in the utility of having minions. Minions will distract enemies from hitting you. So it doesn't seem like there would be a good way to not have minions. I also think that maybe the Necromancer, just on the skill tree in general, should have something that says if you don't have minions, you do more damage with core skills, you do more damage with corpse skills, just in general, if you don't have minions. Because not running minions shouldn't just be like, well, I don't like the way they look, so I'm not going to do it. Like, it's a preference. It'd be like in Diablo 3 if you didn't have a follower because you don't like having a follower. You'd be foolish not to have one because the followers are really good. But you could definitely do it, right? Like, it's an option. But like, you'd be kind of an idiot for doing it. And that's kind of the way it is in this game right now. The only other thing I'll say about minions is it does seem weird to me that there's one button for raising warriors and mages. And there's also a lot of aspects or powers in the game that say skeletons, so it impacts them both. And while it's good because, like, I don't want to take up multiple slots for summoning minions, I also think at the same time it might be a little strong, or that maybe there should be a reason you would want to run just warriors or mages. Because again, you know, they're just too good not to run right now. But yeah, I thought that was kind of weird. The golem is its own skill, but the minions are all one button. I felt like the Necro Legendaries overall were pretty boring as well. It seemed like with the Rogue at the end of the beta, I had such a strong build. And I definitely feel that way here too, but it's like I've just thrown stuff on my gear that's like giving me damage. I haven't thrown stuff on my gear that makes me like stand out in a particular spec, if that makes any sense. You know, like with the Rogue, with a lot of people, you built like a Twisting Blades character and you sort of synergize all your gear based around like Twisting Blades and keeping that skill up, or what can support Twisting Blades. With the Necromancer, it felt like I was just putting the best thing on that was on that slot. Like, for example, even though I don't feel like this build is a minion build, like the minions are just too good not to run. They do pretty good damage, but obviously my character is doing the majority of the work in this build. But like these boots, for example, just increase the number of warriors. Like just more minions is good. So like it was just best in slot. Same thing, like more mages. It was just more mages, more minions are good because they're just good right now. But outside of that, I kind of just did the best I could to do this like sort of shadow damage over time character. Again, mostly because, you know, the shadow skills were the new stuff, right? Like Blighted Corpse Explosion was brand new. Blight was brand new. Sever's brand new. So really, to me, the way I could have the most fun was playing brand new stuff. And obviously, I really, really like damage over time. I think that was one of the most surprising things about coming into this Diablo 4 beta, is that the Necromancer doesn't have poison damage, like, which I feel is pretty nutty. You know, Diablo 3, we had poison damage, but that's just like an elemental type. Really, in Diablo 3, you don't really do damage over time. But in Diablo 2, you know, poison was such a big part of the class. Poison Nova, Poison Dagger. So to not have poison damage is kind of crazy to me. The only reason I could think that they maybe did that is because druids and rogues have poison damage, and maybe they didn't want 3 classes in the base game that did poison damage. So what they've sort of done instead is given us the shadow damage over time effect, which you could basically call poison, but I don't know why they didn't just make it poison damage instead of shadow damage. It doesn't really bother me because it performs the same, but it feels weird not to have poison. As far as look and feel, I do like how the Necro looks. I obviously wish there was more face and hair options. I don't really care at the end of the day because you're covered in armor most of the time, but I do like their appearance. I do look like they've got like sort of one foot in the door into like their deathbed. I did love the eyes. You can make these like red or green. I thought that was pretty cool. But I will say the one thing that I hated, and this is such a weird complaint for me because I normally don't care, but the Necro male voice just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. It's sort of this posh, like English accent, and it doesn't sound good. And honestly, it ruined cutscenes for me, the few that I do watch, or just hearing them talk in combat. Like, I don't have the resource for that, or I can't do that yet. The voice doesn't fit Necro, and maybe that comes from just so much time playing D2, D3. But I think they were going for kind of like a smart ass sounding voice, but it doesn't come off that way. It just comes across as like posh and British. I do like the raspy, sort of very dark Diablo 3 Necro voice. I'd like to see it be more like that. Like right now it's like, oh, I can't do that yet. And it should be like, I can't do that yet. But yeah, weird complaint, I know. But still, I hated it. I hate his voice. One of the other weird things I noticed, so Necro can use scythes, wands, swords, two-handers, but also daggers, but you can't roll for daggers, which is weird because dagger is like the best base type the Necro can use. I also wasn't crazy about, we'll just roll on one real quick. I wasn't crazy about these scythes, which, you know, arguably is what you'd want to be using as a Necro to sort of fit that theme. The base on a scythe is life on kill, which is awful. Like wands get lucky chance, which, you know, if you're building a lucky type build, that might be pretty good. Axes get damage to healthy enemies, so the first hit, I mean, that's pretty okay. Swords get crit strike damage, which, you know, if you're building a crit build, could be good. But also two-hand scythes get, you know, life on kill. But for the sake of my build, I wanted daggers because daggers is just damage to close enemies. So all of these other effects are pretty good, but you look at Size and its life on kill, like it's not even comparable. Life on kill is terrible compared to those other ones. I do want to say again that I think that Diablo 4, what we're going to see at launch, what we see now, this is the best based Diablo game that we've seen. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so, you know, Diablo 2 came out and it was a pretty fun game. Lord of Destruction came out, it was even more fun. Diablo 3 Vanilla came out, it was a pretty terrible game. Diablo 3 Rebirth Souls came out and it became a playable game. And so what I mean by that is, you know, Diablo 4 in its current form, there's so much work that it needs, but it does have a lot of promise. And I think that Blizzard can definitely get there. So this might sound like I'm just tearing this game apart in some parts of this review. But honestly, I think it's a decent start. And that pretty much sums up, you know, my thoughts on the Necromancer just from 3 days of play testing. Obviously, if I could get more hands-on experience, we could go much further in depth on what I'd love to see change with the Necromancer. But hopefully we do see some pretty big changes from now until launch for the Necromancer. I think that there's some gaping holes here. But enough about me and what I think. I want to know what you guys think. What did you love about the Necro? What did you hate about the Necro? What did you think was okay? What do you want to see improved? Please let me know in the comment section below. I love all the feedback and the ideas, and cumulatively, hopefully we can make this class a lot more fun in Diablo 4. But as always, if you guys did like the video, please do drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you'd like. You can be guaranteed you'll find Diablo 4 Necro content right here on this channel. And of course, follow me on Twitch if you guys want to see some exciting, high-octane Diablo 4 Necro gameplay when the game comes out. Outside of that, you can follow me on Twitter for gaming updates, or if you like IRL content, Instagram. Please do follow me there. Anyways, enough about me. We'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.